So here we are. The opening slide is a American goldfinch for everybody to enjoy. So I will start here. And my presentation today is, as Jamie mentioned, I'm with the Chicago Audubon Society. And the photos that you're going to see in the presentation today were mostly taken by a fellow named Roger Shamley, who is a former president of the Chicago Audubon Society. So most of these birds that you will be seeing today are Chicago birds. A few that I didn't have pictures of from him, I did include pictures from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology website. And what we're going to talk about today will be about how to attract birds to your backyard. We'll first talk about the resident birds who live in Chicago all year round. And then we'll talk about the ones who come here just in the summer to nest and raise their young. And it will be perhaps surprising to you to find out that some of the birds that are actually most common around our backyards are not native to North America. They've been introduced, and we'll talk about that. And I'll give you some feeding tips, what kinds of foods that they're going to be looking for that will help bring them into your yard, and also some tools and resources about how to go about bird watching. So with that, we'll first talk about what birds want, because that's what's going to, if you can provide that, that's what they're looking for. That's how they will come to your backyard. And basically birds are looking for the same thing that we do. What our basic needs are: food, water, shelter, nest sites. And in the case of food, one of the wonderful things that you can do, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation, is to plant native plants in your yard. Our native birds are looking for the plants that they've always been around, that they feed on, that they know to feed on. So native plants, and also feeders, bird feeders, of course, bring them in and make them easy to see, brings them out in the open. Water is important. They need water both for drinking, like we do, and also for like we do for bathing. They need, very important for them to keep their feathers clean. That's what keeps them warm in the winter and dry in rainstorms. So looking for a place to take baths is also important for them as well. And shelter. There are predators around, and so birds want to feel safe, just like we want to feel safe in our homes. And so having some vegetation, some brush or trees nearby when you have a bird feeder is great, because if one of the birds calls an alarm that they've seen something that it worries them, a predator of some sort, they sound an alarm, and all the birds, you will notice, will fly off your feeder. And the closer that they have a place to hide within vegetation or trees or brush piles, the safer that the safer they'll feel at your feeders. And also leaving leaf litter around your plants, which is not something we tend to try to clean up everything in the fall, but a little leaf litter around will provide in the spring, when the birds migrate through, will provide a source of insects that the migrating birds are looking for. So that will bring some migrating birds on the ground into your yard as they poke through that leaf litter looking for bugs. And then finally, nest sites. And a lot of these birds will use old woodpecker holes and things in trees. They're largely cavity nesters, are resident birds, not exclusively, but largely. And they also use those holes in the winter for roost holes, where they stay warm and where they sleep. So having trees around that have that kind of feature is great. But also nest boxes. Nest boxes will work too. That cavity nesters will find those sometimes appealing as well, for either roost sites or nest sites. So first we'll talk about some of our native bird, our resident birds, the birds that live here all year round. And the first bird that we'll talk about is the northern cardinal, and probably a familiar bird to everybody. As you see here, there's two birds in the picture, and I'm guessing you might be able to guess the difference between these two birds. And if you guessed male and female, you are correct. Very commonly in the bird world, the male is the very colorful bird, and the female tends to be a lot more drab. And uh, if we were together in person, I'd take some answers to my question of why do you think that is? Why are females more drab? Since we're on Zoom, I'll talk about it a little bit. Um, be, Largely, the theory is because they are the one who sit on the nest. They are the ones who brood the eggs or incubate the eggs and brood the young. So they spend a lot of time on the nest. And again, with predators being around, they wouldn't want to attract a lot of attention to that nest and their vulnerable young. So the theory goes that the female is the one to be more drab, whereas the male is more colorful. He has to attract a female. He has to make himself visible as a defender of their territory, so other cardinals don't come in and take over their territory because they need to defend their food sources while they're raising their young. And I will also now play their song for you. And that's a common sound around here this time of year and has been since spring, so I'm sure you've heard it. Uh, the northern cardinal is not only the state bird of Illinois, it's the state bird of 7 states in our country. And their diet consists of seeds and fruit. And if you look at the beak shape, you'll see that conical bill. It's very much built for cracking seeds open and getting the nuts out. So that's largely their diet, except when they are raising young, they have to switch to eating insects because they need that protein source so that their nestlings will grow very quickly. And so they do switch to, as many birds do, switch to eating insects while they've got young birds in the nest. Something unique about the cardinals is that the female will also sing on the nest. That's usually not the case. We think it might be because she's signaling to the male that it's safe to come to the nest to bring food. And one of the seeds that they really like that will attract them is safflower seeds. And here's a picture of safflower seed, what it looks like. It's a small white kernel that if you put that in a feeder, that will tend to attract cardinals as well as other birds. And our next bird, the resident bird of the Chicago area, is the chickadee. And I will play their song for you, and while I'm playing it, see if you can guess how they got their name. Chickadee dee 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 dee. So these are one of the birds that named themselves. And in this case, there's only a picture of only one bird because both sexes look alike. You can't tell the males from the females. They are tiny, tiny birds, and they are so small and light that while I'm not recommending anybody do this, if you put 3 of them in an envelope, you would be able to mail them for 1 postage stamp. That's how small and how light they are. They're known to be very inquisitive birds, but as being small, when they come to feeders, what they will tend to do, they don't want to spend a lot of time out in the open on the feeder. So they will come to a feeder and take a seed, but then they'll be looking for a nearby bush or tree or plant, some large plant, where they can hide safely, where they feel safe, and they'll eat the seed while they're perched inside that bush where they're sheltered, and then they'll fly back to the feeder and get another seed, and that's how their feeding strategy works. You might wonder, given how small they are, how in the world do they survive cold Chicago winters? And the way that they do it, and a lot of these birds will do it too for the smaller ones, is they have a roost hole somewhere where they can shelter and sleep, but their bodies go into a state of torpor, which is kind of like a semi-hibernation where their metabolism slows way down, and they go into that state, and it allows them for their bodies to cool down, and they'll be okay. But it makes it very important then when the sun rises that they start moving around in the sun and start feeding right away, because that is how they warm themselves up. So these guys are particularly appreciative of some seeds around so that they can feed on first thing in the morning to get themselves going in the winter. Chickadees, like cardinals, also like safflower seed. It's one of their favorites. So that will bring them to your yard as well. And they're very curious, inquisitive, and kind of friendly birds. They tend not to flee quite so quickly as you approach them. They will, of course, but not real quickly. So you can come pretty close to them, and because they're curious. And what's great about chickadees is they're very good at finding food. And so migrating birds have learned when they come through an area on migration and they're not familiar with the area, they've learned to hang out with chickadees because the chickadees will find food. And so the migrating birds follow them to food sources uh, as a place so they can refuel while on their migration. So us bird watchers, when we're out and about during migration, when we see chickadees, we always pay attention and look around because chances are we're going to find some other migrating birds with them as well that we like to see during migration. Our next bird resident is the American goldfinch, and they're beautiful yellow birds. You'll see two birds here, and would ask you what's the difference, and the obvious question would be male or female, and in this case, these are both males. They're both male American goldfinches. So what the difference is that goldfinches molt twice a year. So they molt in the spring into the beautiful yellow feathers that you see on the left with the beautiful black cap. And so they're very colorful in the spring and the summer while they're breeding, the males. And then in the fall, the males molt again, and they molt into this more drab coloration. And that is how they spend the winter until they molt again in the spring. Now the females tend to be the drab version, maybe even a little less yellow than what you see here in the picture. So they look much closer alike in the winter than in the summer. And I'll play their song for you. And some people like to think that the end of that song sounds like potato chip. It's got the rhythm of potato chip. Uh, and they're still singing right now because goldfinches are the last birds to nest in our area. And the reason that they nest late relative to the other birds is their favorite native seed that they like to eat is Niger seed or thistle. And when you think about when thistles bloom and set their seed, it's around now. And so they time their nesting so when their favorite food source is more plentiful. And if you want to bring them to your yard. Here's a picture of Niger seed or thistle seed. It's a tiny black seed. So you need special feeders because it will kind of pour out of the holes of the regular ports on bird feeders. So these screen feeders that they can cling to or sock feeders are common as well. Goldfinches are the only bird who really hang upside down. And so in order to prevent house sparrows and other from taking all the thistle seed, there are feeders available where the port is actually underneath the perch to accommodate this way that goldfinches feed. It isn't foolproof in terms of keeping the sparrows out. They're pretty smart at figuring it out, but it makes it harder for them, discourages them. And our next bird is the house finch. And this is male and female house finch. And I will play their song for you. And the house finches are pretty much one of the first birds to start seriously singing. And they'll do it as early as February. So it's always wonderful when I hear somebody singing early in February. Generally, singing continuously, it's the house sparrows that have already started. And house sparrows are not, house finches, sorry. The house finches are not native to our area. They are native to North America, but they really originated in the western part of the United States. And back in 1940, somebody in New York decided to bring a cage full of house finches to New York and try to sell them as cage birds. And apparently this didn't go well and they were not successful. So they let that cage full of house finches go, and they did fine. They survived fine in New York, and they thrived and they reproduced, and the population grew and the population grew and spread all over eastern US as well. The first house finches arrived in Illinois in 1971. So they've only been here 50 years, but now they are very common all over the place. They've survived well. And our next bird is the downy woodpecker. And see here if you can see the difference between the male and the female. It's just one little spot. And it happens to be on the crown or the back crown of the head. The males have a little red spot on the back of their heads, and the females don't. So that is how you tell the difference between a male and a female. And here's how they sound. So woodpeckers, in terms of food, they like suet. They'll come to suet cages. So hanging one of those in your backyard could bring in the woodpeckers. They also like sunflower seeds. They will come to feeders as well, the smaller woodpeckers, which downies are. And when you hear them pecking in the woods and on trees, uh, if it's really loud, we know that they peck in the bark of trees for food, but if it's the pecking is very loud, they're actually not feeding. It's something called drumming, and it actually serves the same purpose as singing. It's a sound that they make. They'll find a hollow branch somewhere, so it really reverberates loudly. So they're announcing territory. They're looking for a mate, same as the songbirds. And so they have both methods of doing that in terms of a song and in terms of the drumming. If they're actually poking around looking for insects, they may actually make a very soft, much softer pecking sound. It's not nowhere near as loud as their drumming. And another common woodpecker in our area is the red-bellied woodpecker. And the reason it got its name is because, if you notice here, they actually do have a rosy wash on their belly. So they got the name the red-bellied woodpeckers. Instinctively, one would think they would be called a red-headed woodpecker. However, they don't have that name because there actually is a red-headed woodpecker, and it is native to our area. And it's a gorgeous bird with this beautiful, beautiful, fully red head. Unfortunately, it's not really a backyard bird. They're very habitat specific. They really like oak savannas, where so they like the oak trees, but they also like the space between the trees where they can fly around, because red-headed woodpeckers are also flycatchers. So they'll eat the insects off of bark like other woodpeckers, but they also fly around and catch insects as well. So they need that kind of space, which is why they like savanna habitat. So back to the red-bellied woodpecker. Uh, Again, they got this name because of that rosy wash, but you generally don't see that because they're usually pressed up against a tree like this. What's unique about woodpeckers and how they're adapted to their foraging style of clinging to the bark of trees and picking insects out of the crevices of the bark. First of all, it's their tongue. If you look their tongue, they can stick that tongue out 2 inches. It's a really long tongue out of the end of their beak. So they can reach, as they peck away space in that crevice, that tongue can reach way deep into the bark uh, in order to bring out an insect. Their saliva is very sticky, and their tongue, the tip of their tongue actually is barbed. So both of those things will help them pull insects, retrieve insects out of the bark. The way they move up and down a tree, they need some leverage as they cling to the side of the tree, and they use their tail for that. So their tail feathers are unusually stiff for a songbird. And their feet are also uniquely adapted to clinging to the bark, to the side of the tree. Generally, the perching birds have 3 toes up and 1 toe down, and they perch and clamp on branches that way. And that's generally how their feet are configured. But in the cases you look here with the woodpecker, they have 2 toes up and 2 toes down, and that helps them cling vertically to the bark. And what woodpeckers will do is cache seeds. They will take seeds off your feeder, and they will take it and jam it into the bark of trees and other safe places that they know of, and they'll hide a lot of seeds from your feeder into the trees. And then during the winter, it's just something that they naturally do. During winter, when natural food is a little more scarce, um, they can remember where they put all these seeds. In fact, a study once showed that a red-bellied woodpecker remembered the location of 2,000 seeds it had cached. And that is what the hippocampus is about, the last item there. The hippocampus is a portion of their brain that's tied to memory. And in the woodpeckers, it's unusually large. So they have a lot of space for memory where they've cached all their seeds. And another bird who caches seeds like the woodpeckers do is the white-breasted nuthatch. And it's interesting in terms of identifying the nuthatches. You'll see this posture here, how the bird is actually kind of pointed down. Its tail is up, its head is down. It's also clinging to the side of the tree like a woodpecker, but woodpeckers, their heads are up and their tails are down, and that's how they know to move up and down a tree. Whereas a nuthatch can actually have a posture like this. So if you see a bird clinging to the side of a tree with its tail up and its head down, bingo, it's a nuthatch. They're the only bird that can do that. They also look alike. Both the male and the female look the same. And this is their song. It's rather unusual for a songbird, so very distinctive. They also, as I mentioned, their posture with their face down. They also cache seeds like woodpeckers. They, in fact, it's actually also, so they cache seeds for the winter as well, but it's also their feeding strategy. What they will do is take a seed off a feeder and jam it into a crack on a tree and then peck at it until they release the nut out of the husk. And so early people watched them do that and thought, well, they're hatching the nut out of the seed. And so that's how they named themselves and got the name nuthatch. They also tend to flock with chickadees. The two of them tend to travel around together, and you see them together quite frequently. And another, I'm sure, common bird to everybody is the mourning dove. And I'm going to play their song and see if you can tell how they got their name. Don't they sound sad? So they named themselves as well. They have a very sad sounding song. Oops, sorry. Uh, they tend to feed on the ground. So you'll also often see them in pairs, and they'll be feeding on the ground. And they provide a great service for those of us with bird feeders because they will tend to clean up a lot of the waste seed off the feeders. They're too big generally to land on the feeders. So what they'll do is they go to the ground underneath the feeder and clean things up. So they provide a great service for us. And they will eat between 12 and 20% of their body weight every day, about 71 calories. So they're hearty eaters. And you'll also notice when they take off from the ground, you'll hear a whistling sound. It's the sound of the air whistling through their feathers. So their wings make a sound when they take off, and you can hear them do that. They're larger birds, so they're longer lived birds as well. In fact, the oldest one in captivity that I read about lived 30 years. And I'm sure you all recognize this next bird, the blue jay. Blue jays really like acorns, and they will catch them when the acorns start falling or are ripe on the oak trees in the fall. And because they tend to cache them or eat them, uh, the blue jays are credited with the spread of oak trees after the glaciers, that they helped spread oak trees around our continent because they ate so many acorns. And they have a very interesting migration. The individual blue jays, some years they migrate, sometimes they don't. They also aren't necessarily loyal to specific areas where they might spend the winter, so they're very nomadic, and we don't know a lot about their migration. They're good mimics. They will mimic the songs of other birds, and they're especially good at mimicking red-tailed hawks. And I remember a couple of years ago, one time I went out into my backyard and I heard a red-tailed hawk, but it was coming from our neighbor's bushes. I'm like, wow, that's a really bizarre place for a red-tailed hawk. So I go wandering over there looking for a red-tailed hawk, and I find a blue jay. So that blue jay even fooled me. And a little interesting fun fact about blue jays is what color their feathers are. You look at this color, at this picture, and you think, well, their feathers are blue. And actually, it's because of the structure of the feather and how it reflects light. And again, I'm not suggesting you do this, but if you were to take one of those feathers and stick it in a blender and grind it all up so that it loses its structure, it's actually a grayish brown. And so that blue is actually reflection off their feather because of the structure. And another interesting bird around our area is the common crow. These are corvids like the blue jays, and the crows particularly are known to be very, very smart birds, and they have been studied quite extensively. We know they are. Uh, Crows are longer lived birds as larger birds are, and so they are very social. They tend to stay together in family groups, and because they have a longer lifetime in which to reproduce, they actually don't become mature for breeding until their second year. So what happens is last year's young will stay with their parents another year and will help their parents raise the current year's brood and learn a little bit about parenthood. And then we'll start breeding in their second year. Uh, they're known in terms of, I was talking about how smart they were. They're known to be able to recognize people. And a study was done years ago where somebody wearing a mask uh, went up to a crow's nest and fussed with the nest. And the crows, of course, went crazy and mobbed him and made him go away. And the next day, he walked underneath that nest without the mask. And the crows just ignored him and he walked on past the tree. The next day he went back wearing that mask and walked under the tree. Crows mobbed him. They remembered that face and they mobbed him. And it's known that years later they remember. And somebody with that mask walking in that same area, there are probably some descendants of those crows or the same crows, and they remember that mask. I remember they also recognize vehicles. Somebody at a talk I heard uh, was studying crows, and he was studying a roost of crows in Washington State, and was doing studies. So there was a large crow roost, and he would go out to that roost every once a week or something, and study the crows and collect whatever data he was collecting. And the crows would follow him back to his vehicle because they knew when he was done and got back to his vehicle, he always had a bag of peanuts. So when he got back to his vehicle, he would throw peanuts out for the crows, and they'd get their peanuts, and off he would go. And one time he went out to do his study, and they were repaving the parking lot where he normally parked, and he had to park about a block away. And he went to the roost and did his data, and then walked back to his vehicle, but it was in a different place than what the crows were used to. And when he got to his vehicle, the crows were waiting for him. They were sitting on his vehicle as usual, waiting. They just remembered his car. And so they knew where to go to get their peanuts. They just kept looking and they recognized the vehicle for him. They also have been studied and are known to use tools in various experiments. And then people have observed them in the wild as well, in terms of being able to get food and things. They'll use a tool. So very, very smart birds. So you might wonder what predates the birds that we've been talking about? What's a predator of these birds? And a very common one in our area is the Cooper's hawk. They will come, they'll fly through your feeder. Maybe I've only seen it happen a few times, but they'll fly by a feeder and snatch a bird off of it. They capture their prey with their feet, and they are forest birds. They've always lived in the forest, but they are now coming into the suburbs because we put up cafeterias for them in with our bird feeders. And so they've learned and will sometimes come and keep an eye on feeders and get their food that way. Uh, if you find a Cooper's hawk is kind of hanging around your net, your feeder, it might be wise. If it depends on how you feel about things, but if you might take your feeder down for a few days because then the Cooper's hawk will get hungry and go somewhere else. Uh, but that happens. And because they're very adapted to flying through the forest and flying through trees and branches of trees very quickly as they hunt and hunt down small birds. Um, so it's a pretty dangerous lifestyle, and some studies have shown in autopsies that 23% of Cooper's hawks show some evidence of fractures in their bodies as they collided with trees and things as they hunt for birds. And now we get to introduced species. So these are a couple of common birds in our area that are not native to North America. They've been introduced. And the first one is the house sparrow. I'm sure everybody recognizes these birds. Um, and here's the male and the female. The male has that black chin, and the female is all clear and doesn't have the red markings behind the ears. And house sparrows were first introduced to North America in 1851, and they were introduced in New York. They are native to Great Britain, and an Englishman who was living in New York missed his house sparrows from England. So he had a crate full of house sparrows shipped over from England, and he released them by his home in New York. And so he would have house sparrows around him, and they thrived. And they adapted to using man-made structures into human habitats, and they spread all over our continent and are now one of our most numerous birds. And sadly, they're one of the reasons, one of many, but one of the reasons for the decline of our native songbirds, because they're very feisty and will outcompete our native birds for nest sites. And so that's one of the reasons that our native birds have declined. If you don't want to feed them, they don't tend to prefer safflower. They'll eat it. You know, everybody will eat anything if they're hungry, but they tend to find something else. So it's one of the ways to discourage them from your feeder. And ironically, while they're very numerous and healthy here in North America, they are in pretty bad decline in their native land and are a species of concern in Great Britain. So very, very ironic. And another bird that is around here that was introduced is the European starling. And you see two pictures of starlings here. And again, this is not male and female. It's, if you look at the background of the photographs, you will see the difference. One is a starling in the winter and one is a starling in the summer. But they don't molt twice a year. What happens is they only molt in the fall. But what's happened when they molt, their new feathers have these pretty white tips on them. And so they look like this right after they're freshly molted. And then what happens as the year goes by, their feathers get worn and all those white edges, those white tips wear off. And so this is what starlings start to look like this time and later in the summer as they await their next molt. Starlings were introduced in North America in the 1890s. They were released in Central Park because a Shakespeare enthusiast decided that he wanted all of the species of birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays to be in Central Park. So this is one of many non-native species that were released at that time. And starlings were the ones that survived and found a way to thrive in North America, and there's over 200 million of them here today. They move around in large flocks, like house sparrows. They don't particularly like safflower, And like house sparrows also, they are in pretty bad decline in Europe. So again, very ironic that they're doing okay here, but not in their native land. These are our summer breeders, and that come here to raise their young in the summer. You will all recognize the American robin. And because I'm sure you know a robin song, I will skip that. Um, and the robins come back, the ones that migrate, most of them do, but they don't migrate very far. They come back very quickly because they don't go very far away in the spring, and they get started very early nesting. So as a result, robins can have up to 3 broods every year. So they produce a lot of young, and we don't see them as much in the afternoon or in the winter. And the reason is that they switch to eating fruit in the afternoon, and even while they're raising nestlings, because they've gotten all their early worms in the morning for their young and their nests. But also they can stay here in the winter if there's dried fruit on trees. And so they will find worms by sight. They cock their head, and some people think, well, they're listening for worms, but no, they're looking to find worms by sight, and that's how they hunt. House wrens. There's still a house wren in our backyard singing right now. They come here in the summer, and both sexes look alike. I will play their song. So having a house wren is a pretty cool thing to have that in your backyard, to have them nesting in one of your nest boxes. The bad news is they keep that up all day long. While they're singing, they never stop. It only lasts about a month or so, but you'll notice them. They tend to be pretty feisty little birds. They're small, but they're very feisty. They will use nest boxes. So if you put up the nest box, you might attract a wren. They have an interesting strategy when they build their nests. They will also collect spider eggs and put spider eggs in the nests. And the theory that we think they do that is because they're in a nest box, as they raise their young, things can get a little icky in there. And so parasites can start to be in their nests. And so the theory is that when the spider eggs hatch, the spider larvae eat the parasites and help keep their nest clean. They are strictly insectivorous. They only eat insects. So these birds have to migrate. They cannot stay here. They cannot survive here in the winter. And another bird that is completely insectivorous is chimney swifts. They're not exactly backyard birds. They stay up in the sky, and they fly around in the sky. They particularly flock in the evenings. So if you see a bird that looks in this shape, they kind of look like cigars with wings. And they have a very distinctive sound. If you hear this sound up in the air, you look up and you'll see these birds. And the cool thing about chimney swifts is that they are up there eating insects, largely mosquitoes. So having chimney swifts around is a good thing. They provide a community service and eat lots of mosquitoes. They also are strictly insectivorous, and they come a long way to be here in the summer. This area here is where they nest and raise their young here in North America, Eastern North America. They migrate across the Gulf. They will migrate through the Caribbean islands or through Latin America. And here is where they winter, all the way down here in South America. So these birds have an amazing migration. They can sleep on the wing. So when we see them here, be aware that they came a long, long way to get here. And a favorite backyard bird for I think many people is the ruby-throated hummingbird. And it is the only hummingbird east of the Mississippi. So when you see a hummingbird around here, chances are it's a ruby throat. The males have the gorgeous red throat. The females have a gray throat. That is the difference. And they are here from May through September. They will come to feeders. They eat both nectar, so they go to flowers. They like red flowers, red tubular shaped flowers like salvia or trumpet vine. They'll come to a hummingbird feeder, and you see some pictured here. The formula for the nectar that you put in the feeder is 4 parts water and 1 part sugar. And the reason that they make that humming sound when they hover around flowers and around the feeder is their wings beat 53 times a second. They have incredibly fast metabolisms. They cannot walk or hop. If you look back at this picture, you'll see they have their little feet and they can perch. They perch on trees, they perch on the feeders, but they can't land on the ground because they really don't, they have legs, but they're so short. So they would be very difficult for them to take off if they ever were on the ground. So you won't see them on the ground. And the amazing thing about these little birds is they migrate across the Gulf of Mexico twice a year. They come here from Mexico and Latin America, and they make an incredible migration, flying nonstop across the Gulf twice a year. Amazing feat for these tiny little birds. And our last bird is the dark-eyed junco. This is a bird that will only come in the winter. You'll only see this bird in the winter. Believe it or not, to this bird, Chicago is a great place to spend the winter. And they are really cute little birds. They look like they're wearing tuxedos. And they will clean the seeds up again underneath your bird feeders. They're ground feeders. So they'll clean up all the waste seed that other birds drop underneath your feeders and help keep things clean. So they're a nice bird to have around in the winter. And they're strictly seed eaters. So we like having them, and I'll show you why they're here in the winter. Here's their breeding range. This red area is where they nest in the summer. So they live right now, they're way up in the Arctic, nesting and raising young. And so they come down here to the southern, well, to the United States, and this is where they spend the winter. So they make a long migration as well. So you might want to take a screenshot of this. Here's some sources that you can use to find a little more about plants and what kind of plants provide seeds and fruit and things that our native birds want to eat, and we'll be able to attract them to your yard. So all of these sources have information about that. So take your screenshots. And in terms of identifying birds, everybody's going digital nowadays. So here are some apps. The Merlin app is done by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and will help people get started, beginning birders. It's a great site, and they've also added songs to it now. So it's a really good site. As well as you get more advanced, the iBird Pro and the Sibley's apps, you have to purchase them, but they have a lot of great information to help you learn more about the birds as you identify them, and a lot of songs that you can play and listen to. So when you're out in the field or on your phone, it's a great way to it's like a field guide on your phone. So I use them both very frequently. So I recommend those particularly. And also, if you're old school like me and still like books, here's a couple of suggestions for beginning birders. Something to study when you're home to flip through, or even in the field. So a lot of us still carry field guides around in our backpacks, and use them as well. They're great sources of information when you're trying to identify birds. And I have to give a little commercial for the Chicago Audubon Society. We provide a lot of great information, educational programming. We do bird walks, conservation advocacy, stewardship of habitat, and some research. So we're a good source for education. And if you really want to learn how to identify birds, there's no substitute to getting out on a bird walk with people who know the birds and can help teach you. And we do love having beginners with us because we get to see the birds for the first time through your eyes. And so we're always happy and thrilled to have beginners join us. So don't hesitate. And this is how you learn more about Chicago Audubon. Here's our website, chicagooaudubon.org. And we also have a Facebook site, we're on Instagram and YouTube. So we welcome all of you to use us as a resource. That's what we're here for. And so with that, I will stop sharing and take questions.
All right. That was great. Thank you, Roberta. This is really informative. We do have some questions in the chat, and as you are listening to the answers of these questions, if you have some of your own, please feel free to put that in the chat. So Elena's wondering, looking for ideas on how to discourage grackles and bully birds from emptying my feeders and scaring away the smaller birds.
Yeah. Using feeders that will accommodate smaller birds. With perches that are a little smaller, it'd be harder for the grackles that are pretty big, harder for them to perch on the feeders. Also feeders that don't have the saucers on the bottom, because the larger birds can cling to those saucers. So if there's no saucer there and the perches are shorter, it's harder for them to feed on those feeders. So that's an idea. I pretty much exclusively use safflower for that reason. I've not had any trouble with grackles, but they're probably not as frequent around my backyard. But that might help as well. They may not like safflower. It seems like some of these birds don't prefer it. So that's another thought.
Nice. And Dan is wondering, why do the goldfinch lose their color?
Why do the goldfinches lose their color? They don't need it in the winter. That color is there for them to help attract a mate, as all birds, and also to males. And so it's unique that goldfinches do this twice a year molt, whereas say a male cardinal stays red all year round. But it's unique to them. And then they have their pretty feathers out in the spring to attract the ladies, and also to establish territory, makes them visible.
Nice. Okay. And Hale, I haven't heard of this before, but Hale is wondering, please explain the phrase "to eat crow." Do they taste bad?
Okay, that's something everybody gets to Google when we sign off. That's a great question, and I've never been asked that one before, so I will be looking that up as well. I have no idea.
Okay, I'm not the only one. Okay. Michelle is wondering, you didn't mention herons. We have what I believe are herons in the pond in our area. Can you give us some information about them? Is there any way to keep or attract them?
Oh, well, if they hunt in water. They are birds with long legs, so they can wade in shallow water, and so they move very stealthily, and they will catch fish or amphibians or whatever is in the shallow part of the water, and that's how they feed. So if you have a pond that's big enough that it hosts fish, and that water's edge in the mud, the amphibians and things around there, or maybe they don't really they go to streams a little bit, something like that. So it would be a unique backyard habitat, but that's the kind of habitat they're looking for feeding.
Okay.
Congratulations, cool birds to have around and watch.
Awesome.
They're fun to watch.
And Linda wanted to mention or comment, They're seeing fewer hummingbirds this summer than in the past. Could the presence of crows and blue jays scare other birds like this away?
Um, it might, but hummingbirds are pretty agile, so I think they'd be hard for those birds to catch because crows and blue jays just can't fly as agilely as a hummingbird can. It's possible. Um, some years we have more I mean, in my experience feeding hummingbirds, some years we have more than others. I do agree. It seems like this year there's not as many as there might normally be. So, but it seems to ebb and flow year by year, at least in my experience.
Okay. And Elaine is wondering, when you see big birds riding the air currents, how can you tell if it's a turkey vulture or a red tail or Cooper's hawk?
Oh, yeah. Well, Cooper's hawk tend to stay more in the forest. They will fly, but they don't tend to soar the way a turkey vulture or a red-tailed hawk does. They're the ones that kite or glide, as you mentioned, or ride thermals, or just hold out their wings and glide in the wind. The easiest way, besides that, I mean, if you watch them with binoculars, you'll see the red tail on a hawk it banks and catches the sunlight. Uh, Vultures are all black. They tend their secondary and tertiary wings, the wings on the are feathers on the ends of their wings, tend to be a little more transparent, so you'll see that as well. But the easiest way to tell is that I've used my hands here and sort of the turkey vulture, its wings will go up a little bit from its body when it glides, and so if you see the wings more in a V shape like this, that's what turkey vultures do, whereas the profile of a gliding red-tailed hawk will be more flat.
Hmm.
So that's from a distance, one great way of telling them apart.
Ah, okay, very cool. And let's see. Yeah, Michelle wanted to mention, yes, she has a retention pond in the backyard. So yes. And Elaine wanted to mention too that she wasn't seeing very many hummingbirds either. Um, I've seen a couple in my backyard, but I think because I planted some natives that they like, they've been around. But
Yeah.
I have a question. So I have a bird in my backyard. And for a while there, I thought it was just like a flock of all different types of birds. And then I realized it was one bird, like mimicking the call of a bunch of different ones. And I'm not sure what it is. Somebody said it was a magpie, but I'm not sure. So do you have any ideas as to what that would be?
The two other mimics around here could be gray catbird.
Mhm.
So if you play Google gray catbird for the song and play it, see if it sounds like that, because they will mimic other birds and they'll go through a whole different series of birds, but then they throw something in that's kind of sounds like a meow, which is how they got the name. So if you listen for that meow sound, that's in a gray catbird, they will stay inside a bush. They'll be very hard to find. They hide inside bushes and they're dark. So they're hard to find. So they're very dark gray, almost black bird, uh, with a darker black cap.
Okay.
So that, and another mimic that we might have around is a brown thrasher. They're a big bird, pretty visible, brown, a reddish brown and white speckled bird, pretty big with a long tail.
Okay.
So you would see them probably if you looked at flying around.
Okay. Okay. I'll take
And
a look.
they sing in twos. When they mimic other birds, they'll sing the song twice.
Oh,
So something that repeats once and then goes on to another song and repeats it and goes on to another song and repeats it. So they sing it, they do their songs in a pair,
okay.
or
I
they're
have
mimicking.
work now. Okay, cool. And Linda is wondering, how common are Baltimore Orioles?
Oh, pretty common. You have to have the right habitat for them or the right kinds of trees. But they're common. They migrate. They're only here in the summer. Beautiful birds. To bring them into your yard, it's hard to keep them unless you have the right kind of trees. Um, but to bring them into the yard, put oranges, cut an orange in half, and nail it to a tree, or there are oriole feeders where you put the orange half on a spike in the feeder, and then there'll always be a little cup, and you fill that cup with grape jelly. So it's the orange that attracts them and brings them down, but it's the grape jelly that keeps them around. They love grape jelly.
Uh,
Uh, but they make these nests they weave nests that hang from branches,
okay,
and like little like socks.
cool.
And so they need the right tree structure in order to be able to build their nests.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen them around my yard too, but haven't been able to keep them. So they only stay, are they migratory birds or do they stay around all year long?
No, they're migratory.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, they're only here for the summer, but they're
Oh,
so beautiful.
they are. So, all right. Well, I don't see any more questions. I'm going to share my screen really quick to let you know about some programs that we have coming up soon. And I just want to say thank you so much, Roberta. This was wonderful. I hope everyone checks out your website, Chicago Audubon Society. Um, really great. So, all right.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And the dog says it's about time to program. My dog
She held off until now, thank goodness.
My dog has been pretty good, just taking a nap right now. So I'll try to get through my programs here that are coming up. We on July 30th at 12 p.m. I believe that's a Friday, little lunchtime program, movie, music, romance. That we're going to be talking about a lot of different romantic movies that or romantic romance songs that are in some of our favorite movies. And then on let's see, August 3rd at 6:30, Destination Heartland History. That's going to be a lot of fun. The description is from prehistory to present. Hear the tales and visit the museums, living history venues, and archaeological sites, historic towns, vintage farms, reenactments, and even restaurants of the Midwest. So that if you can't travel this summer, that's the program to go to if you're not traveling around the Midwest. So all right, well, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. And it's raining right now, so maybe you can, I don't know, revisit the program here. So it is being recorded, by the way, and it'll be available for 2 weeks. So, all right, well, have a good one.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.